by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the MarketsWiki education history-focused video series, and more.
Market openings were really the most memorable, I guess, and again, a regular, just emotional experience, because it's just unbelievable how, as you watch that clock ticking down, it got more and more uncomfortable and the tension just started growing in the room. I mean, you just felt it in the entire room. And then the bell would go off. And honestly, especially if I had something to do. If I really wanted to do something early on, or I had some inkling for whatever reason that a broker had an order that I wanted to get to, or, and if I had an agenda, I mean, you would just feel the heart rate just go up, and it would be like you just had, just shut down, 3 espressos, and you didn't do a thing except for watch that clock and know that the bell was about to ring. And then it was just, I mean, John, you were down there at times. I don't know if you were in the pits, but you were down there. And there's the minute the bell rang, it was just an explosion of activity. And there's nothing like it. There's really nothing like it. It happened every single day. And it was just amazing, the energy, the massive amount of energy that was expended when you had that many people there with that much of an agenda. And it was, to an outsider, it was just the most chaotic experience you could possibly imagine. As an insider, it was very orderly. You know exactly what was happening, but it was something. Those openings were amazing. So from a personal side, a personal perspective, I traded a little bit different on the opening than some. I found that it was just about impossible for me to be able to see what was going on anywhere in the pit on the opening, except for in my absolute immediate area. So I absolutely focused on 1 or 2, sometimes 3, but 1 or 2, and even if it was 3, there was one of those that I was really focusing on, of the brokers, and just ignored everything else. And I'd hear later about guys next to me who made like an amazing trade across the pit on the open, and I never did that because I wasn't even looking, and I wasn't even, because I just felt it was impossible to do when there were plenty of opportunities right by where I was. The brokers and the locals relied on one another. The brokers, of course, were the entire order flow. It was our entire substance came through the brokers, and the brokers needed the locals to make them the markets. So there became a certain type of chemistry and arrangement among certain brokers. It's, unless you're a very, very large trader, which I was not, the very large traders had a lot of relationships pretty much with all of the brokers. If you weren't a very large broker, then you sort of tended to start having some chemistry and some relationships with the people that were very close to you. So it was very much of a real estate game. I literally, had a pretty good spot in the pit, but I had my spot, and it was a, 1x1 square foot, or smaller than that, probably 8 by 8 inches. That was mine. And there were a couple of brokers nearby, and those brokers and I formed some relationships. Now, a couple of them were really nice guys, a couple of them not so much. The integrity was in our pit was really, really high. The brokers did not give away information. The brokers did not disclose what they were doing. There were times when I think they expected a little too much of us when they wanted to, when they had to get something done, and they just kind of jammed it in your face and turned around. And you kind of had to put up with that because that's just the way it was, and they were your lifeline. I think in other places, I know that I heard the stories from Cooper Neff and from other people, and some of the other exchanges, especially the New York exchanges, it felt to me like there was a lot more of camaraderie between the brokers and the locals, a lot more of taking care of one another, if you will. That really didn't happen here. And I found that the brokers, and if a new person came in the pit and there was a stranger and they had a better bid, a better offer, they got the trade. And there were not many exceptions to that. cut my teeth in Philly with Cooper Neff, and then it was time to move on. We were a specialist unit on the Philadelphia Stock Exchange and trading equity options. Philly listed the first index option product, which was on the value line, and the value line futures actually were listed at the Kansas City Board of Trade. Kansas City Board of Trade was a sleepy old grain exchange. They traded a secondary wheat contract, and all of a sudden got this stock index future, which was very successful and really interesting in that it was really the pit or the membership was made up of old grain guys, and anybody who was younger was really a second or third or fourth generation grain guy. And all of a sudden they're trading a stock index product that's cash settled and having lots of volume come in, and it was a real shock to them. So I don't know if we were specialists or Philadelphia Trading was specialist. That was one of our biggest competitors, which was Jeff Yass's group, and it was called Philadelphia Trading at the time. Of course, he later changed the name to Susquehanna, and we all know what that is. So we were big traders in the value line options, and it was decided that I would go out to Kansas City and build up our futures hedging operation, set up a brokerage division out there so that we could hedge our options positions from Philly, and then I would come to Chicago after that. Well, I got to Kansas City, and it was quite an awakening. While I love Kansas City, the Board of Trade itself, it was the epitome of the old boy network. And I'm a 24-year-old Jewish guy coming from what they said was New York. I was coming from Philly. I was coming from Chicago, but I was basically the New York Jew, and that is exactly what they called me. And very anti-Semitic, very anti, city boy coming in kind of a thing. And it was very hostile. It was really tough. I couldn't get trades. At about the same time or shortly thereafter, Philadelphia Trading sent their guy out, who's my age, also from the East Coast, also not really the stereotype that was the member of the Kansas City Board of Trade at the time. So it was really tough working in the names they would call us, the way they would ignore us in the trades. A couple of out trades were put at us that I know weren't legit. They were testing us all over the place. But the biggest, I have a story that's very interesting. And as I said, we were probably the biggest options traders, and Philadelphia Trading was the other biggest options trader. And at one point I was in the pit, and my clerk calls me over to the phone, and on the phone was our head trader in Philly, and he gave me an order. Now typically this was the big contract. It was like the equivalent to the big S&P contract. So most trades were one contract, one lot, two lots. Sometimes there'd be a 5 lot, occasionally a 10 lot. So he gave me an order that I had to sell. I think it was 600 futures, and nobody had ever seen anything like that. So obviously there was a big options trade that took place, and I think it was 600, maybe it's 400. We'll call it 600 futures. So, are you sure? Yeah. Are you positive? Yeah. Well, they're going to go ape, if over this, but okay. So I go in the pit and I ask for the market, and the guy from Philadelphia Trading, who's their representative, says like 50 bid. And I said, sold. He goes, how many? I said, 100. And the place goes crazy. 100, right? So everyone's everyone's going crazy. I sold him 100. I said, what is it? He goes, 50 bid. I said, I'll sell you another 540. 540. He goes, buy them. Well, the place erupts. All of a sudden, literally, physically, both of us got charged. And I mean charged, like physically charged, like they tried to get knocked down, and everyone's screaming in our face about a prearranging trade and ruining their markets and being shysters and on and on and on. Well, 5 minutes later, security comes in and takes us off the floor. They take us down to the audits and investigations, and they said, this is a very irregular trade. You guys are in big trouble. We're going to kick you out. You're going to jail, blah, blah, blah. Well, 5 minutes after that, the director of the CFTC office comes over, who was housed in an office across the street. The CFTC had a small office across the street from the Kansas City Board of Trade. And he comes in and he separates the two of us and asks us our story. And my story was exactly what it was. I got called off the floor. I got a phone order to sell 600. I went into the pit and I was able to do it. And I imagine the other guy, Jerry, his story was pretty much the opposite. He got an order to buy 600, and it wasn't a prearranged trade. Now, obviously, I assume we were on the other side of the option trade with one another, and we both had to hedge it. But we both got independent orders, went into the pit, and filled it. But they put us both on a temporary bar from the floor for like 10 days while they investigated. And then they, came back with that it was totally legit and nothing funny had happened. But it was, and after that day, ironically, I think the guys realized that the game had changed and it was a new world out there. But it was scary because these guys were just extraordinarily hostile to us. And when that happened, I mean, I really thought, given a few more minutes and maybe in a different environment, it could have been a bad outcome. Camaraderie around the traders, again, really pretty hostile and really close to the vest as far as what your position is and the competition. Now, we share trades a lot. So if, broker typically would just trade with the person who was first, sometimes not necessarily who was first, but who was closest. But they kind of did their best, but they had a job to do. They had a deck of 30 orders sometimes that they had to bang out, and they just bang, 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 bang. And, sometimes and very often I'd be the one who gets the trade, and I want to do 20 or 30, and the broker would 200, and I own 200, and I know all the guys around me were bidding for it, and I'll go 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, and I'll split it with 5 different guys and 6 different guys and things like that. And then that happened all the time. So we sort of helped each other out in terms of kind of just making the broker shop a little bit easier. So because given enough time, if we weren't busy, he would have split it up among 7 or 8 guys. But when it's busy, we would do that, and we'd always sort of work with one another with that. Errors, sometimes we'd have errors with other locals. Generally, it was rare, frankly. And as time went on, when technology got better and audit trails got better, I spent a little extra money and had 2 trade checkers all the time. So, out trades were, as I mentioned earlier, a big fear of mine. So it was important for me not to have out trades. So I didn't, and my clerks would catch stuff. And then, of course, you'd have to work out a problem right then, but usually it was a smaller problem than if you had to wait to find out from the clearing firm or the clearing corp that you had a problem. So we worked, we worked with one another in ways like that. Again, very clean pit though. I just didn't see a lot of shenanigans going on in that pit. I'm sure they did. There was one time I do remember, it was a firm that had a pretty bad reputation already. Refco exercised like 1,000 options out of the money, and it went to like 4 guys or 5 guys, and like 5 guys ended up with 200 futures, and there was like 10 cents of profit in it the next day, and it was pretty obvious that they did it on purpose. There was a number coming out the next day, and then they came down to the pit like 3 days later and said they wanted us to back out of it, and they wanted us to cut them checks for the amount of money that we made. Well, first of all, it was very difficult to write check to determine what the amount of money made was, because some people got out of it on the open, some people kept it, some people integrated it into their positions. How do you cash settle something like that? And then there was a question from my perspective. I was one of the guys who got to there was a question about the legality of it. Can I even write a check for something like that if 3 days later? Well, it ends up you can, as we found out from OIA. And we did. And I'm pretty sure that they exercised them intentionally and ended up being wrong, and then asked for all the money. So, but they were big order flow, and they put a lot of pressure on their executing broker to basically negotiate on their part and get it done, and he did. But there were other times. Now on the other hand, Richard Dennis did something similar at one point. Exercised a bunch of out of money options. Again, the market opened up that it was a big windfall to people who got assigned, and he pretty much came out and said, "Yeah, I took a shot. I thought something was going to happen and didn't." So he stood up. He stood behind his trade, and he could have done the exact same thing and probably gotten us to DK or to adjust. So many life lessons learned on the trading floor. It's just the fabric of who we are. As traders, it was a very special place. One, and it was easy for me because it's what probably attracted me to the whole thing anyway, is the bond was the word. the bond, or the word was the bond. I take that back. So, and sometimes it wasn't a word; it was and that's it. And you could take it to the bank. It was incredible. I also learned very much how to read people, how to understand who was good at heart, who wasn't good at heart, and then discipline, just straight out discipline. So many life lessons on how quickly something can unravel, on how important it is to always stay in the game and remove yourself from the game when you can't stay in it and keep your head on straight. I often compared trading to being a professional athlete or top professional athlete because it's physical, it's mentally and physically demanding, and you've always got to stay in it, and somebody else always wants your job and will knock you, physically or emotionally knock you down and take it from you. So you become quite a competitor. I also learned from the trading floor how to leave it on the field, so to speak. And it was very easy at times to, have a bad day and want to come home and, carry it home with you. But the beauty always was there's tomorrow and we start fresh. Even if you have a position and you have to get out of it, as soon as you do, you're starting fresh again if you survive, which I always did because I never put myself in that position to not. I started paying attention to electronic trading actually fairly early on from more of a personal investor, just in my Schwab type of accounts and things like that, than on the floor. So I saw it coming. It made total sense to me. I mean, I looked at eBay as basically an exchange and figured, at some point, I always thought that eBay or Microsoft or somebody like that was going to be the one who made the bid for the Board of Trade, not the CME. And there was talk about that at times. We all talked about that. As far as my actual transition, it really, as an options trader, it was much more gradual. I was more concerned, frankly, about whether or not the exchange itself was going to survive. And I really had its demise much earlier than it was. I thought that, I was on that, we're 2 years away plan for 15 years. And it took a long time, especially in the options. The futures went quickly. And as the futures went so quickly, we, of course, had to start hedging our futures electronically instead of using the executing broker. So it was very gradual that I ended up with the computer in my hand. And still, though, I only used it for hedging futures for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, I stayed with paper theoretical sheets and things like that for a long time. And they were very practical for me because I was used to making notes on the physical paper. I used to being able to hold it up in the air where it was light and be able to look at it while I'm looking at the wall boards and looking across the pit and things like that. 99% of the trade, or not 90 plus for sure, for many years stayed in the pits, and certainly on the spreads. And I traded more spreads than I traded outrights. So it wasn't really that big of an impact on the electronic trading. What did happen towards the end of being on the floor was you ended up with a significant more number of trades, maybe the majority of options trades being tied to futures as they were executed. And for that, it was more complex. You needed more technology to price it. And it was so tight. It was just ridiculous how tight these markets were. And the guys who were playing in that game, I just don't understand how they could have possibly been making any money. As a floor trader, and as a trader in general, actually, it's always very difficult to know when things are going to be busy. You don't want to miss these great opportunities, and yet you want to have a life and you can't be on the floor all the time. However, sometimes some weird things happen and you just, life's coincidences take over. I remember when I was on the SIBO trading, at one point there was a huge takeover in United Airlines, and the stock had tripled in value. Implied volatility was trading at about 100. And I migrated into that pit. I was what they call the boat people, which nobody really liked, but I was one of those guys. And I was trading in there for Cooper Neff, assessed a pretty good size position. I went home, had a big position on, and the deal completely fell apart. The unions, the pilots union walked away from the deal. Well, Sunday night, my wife goes into labor with my first child. For the next 3 days, I was in the hospital. My son actually had a little bit of an eye injury in delivery, and was in surgery for the first day. And, for 3 days, I was in the hospital trading on the phone and missing incredible opportunities. When I got back, the guys just gave me a hard time for for months about how I probably missed one of the three best, days of trading in history. And those things happen. As it turns out, it's kind of interesting because the hospital I spent those 3 days in is where I now do magic for Open Heart Magic as a part of my nonprofit. So I'm in the pediatric hospital doing that, every other week. In addition, my son, who was born that weekend, after being a TV producer for 7 years, recently took a job as senior manager of visual storytelling at United Airlines. So it all kind of just comes back together again. And it's just that crazy randomness is part of what makes trading so exciting. First of all, I've always loved magic. And I mean, as a fan, as a audience member, I've always been fascinated by magic. I've liked to try to figure it out. I'm just that kind of guy who wants to know how it's done. And I figured out some of it and didn't figure out the important parts, So I was always fascinated by it. I've been involved in some charitable work for very large organizations in the past, and I wasn't finding it very fulfilling. I was basically a check collector. And even if I was able to, maybe from some friends in the pit or some relative or whatever, get a decent contribution from somebody or a sponsor from a company, it was a contribution that went into a $100 million account. And I didn't really feel a lot of satisfaction from it. So I wanted to get involved in something that was more hands-on. And I came upon this organization, Open Heart Magic, which actually has a lot of traders involved in it. And as soon as I heard about it, I was interested in getting involved from a volunteer and from a governance perspective. So what Open Heart Magic does is we're based in Chicago. It's a nonprofit organization in Chicago, about 13 years old. And we have about 150, I would guess, trained magicians now that volunteer their time and go to pediatric hospitals and perform magic bedside for kids and their families while they're in the hospital. And it's a 13-week training program. You go to Magic University for 13 weeks, 13 Mondays in a row, and learn. You become a pretty darn good magician, through this. If you make it through, you have to audition, you have to test, the whole thing. And if you make it through, then you end up becoming a hospital volunteer at a specific hospital. We're now branched out into Cleveland and Ann Arbor and Detroit, and looking to expand some more. COVID threw us a big loop, so we're just getting back now. The hospital I perform in is not back, but we're just getting back in some of the hospitals. It's been very fulfilling. I can't tell you, John, how many times I'll be in a room, do magic for a kid and his family, and then leave 15 minutes or so in there, leave and have the parents running out in the hallway and telling me that their kid hasn't smiled in 2 weeks and is now laughing. So it's just very, very fulfilling. We're a nonprofit organization, always looking for some funding. And I've learned a lot of magic. I've also been doing I've only done one actual paid gig, but I do a lot of charitable things out there as a magician. So I'll go and, if it's an organization I like, if someone asks me, I'll come to a cocktail hour at a benefit and perform there and things like that. I'm also part of 2 different magic clubs in Chicago, one out of the Chicago Magic Lounge. I don't know if you've been there. It's a really cool place. It's up in Andersonville. And we do that. It's funny though. So I went, I don't know if you can see behind me here, I've got, my old trading jacket with all the stuff on it. It's funny because as a magician now, we have the exact same trading jacket, same pocket, same company they're made by, the whole thing. It's just that on the back now, that's what I wear when I'm in the hospitals. So it's a great organization. And then one thing that's very interesting is a ton of things that make you a good magician are very similar to the things that make you a good trader. And what I mean by that is, for instance, again, that tremendous focus on something. We talked earlier about focusing on a broker in the pit. And here you've got to have tremendous focus on the right things while not letting others know that you're focusing on that as well as, and remembering things. So for instance, what made me successful in the pit a lot of times is I might remember that a broker had an order 2 hours ago when we were at a certain level. And I've got that in the back of my head. And then we get to that level again, and I go to the broker and see if they've got that order. And if they do, that's great. But if they don't, I've got to have another out and a place to go and so forth. When you're doing the magic, I might force you to see a certain playing card. And then many steps later in the trick, I've got to go back to remembering that you had that card and then amaze you in some way of producing it in a different way and things of that nature. It's what I call, being a good magician, I call it relaxed perfection. So you've got to act extremely, relaxed, as if everything's just coming supernatural, while everything in fact is extremely orchestrated, extremely controlled. The risk of it is managed. You have outs to get by. And sometimes it just doesn't work and it goes bad and you blow the trick. And it's just like trading in that sense. There's a magic trick. It's actually an old magic trick, a card trick called Designed for Laughter. I'd love to do it with you, but it only really kind of works if we have more interaction with one another. It's my favorite one. It blows people away in the hospital. It's one of those tricks where the audience member thinks that they're making about 10 different decisions during it. They're not making any. It's like at one point, I make 2 mistakes in it, and either they're really happy because I blew it, or they feel really bad for me. And in the end, it just works, and it's a great trick. I like working with the younger kids, especially with different types of sponge balls and things like that. And I find that if I'm traveling, I always have my sponge balls with me. I know about a year and a half ago, my wife and I were in Paris and we were on the metro, and there's this Parisian kid who clearly doesn't speak any English, and I just catch his eye, and all of a sudden I bring out the sponge balls and do something that he just goes crazy, so things like that happen a lot. But yeah, I've got a few favorites when we're together sometime, and I welcome anyone who's watching this to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to either tell them a little more about Open Heart Magic, whether they want to be involved as a magician or support us or anything like that, and I'll be happy to show a magic trick as well.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our MarketsWiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.